The city of Salvatore never truly slept. It merely changed its masks, transitioning from a daytime hum steeped in soot, sweat, and filth to a nocturnal, sticky anticipation. Here, on the outskirts of the merchant quarter, where the cobblestones had long been overgrown with moss and the stench of rot had become an integral part of the air, stood the iron shop. In its basements, in places where not even the most insolent ray of sunlight could penetrate, in an endless, oppressive silence broken only by the rhythmic dripping of water from the stone vaults, lived the one who had been officially struck from all registries of the living. Aelina, once a daughter of the supreme clan, whose blood was so ancient that her genealogy traced back to the first Orcish kings, was now merely a figure in the corner, wrapped in gray, scratchy rags. Her skin, which had once glowed with a noble olive hue, had now taken on an earthy pale color, the color of a creature deprived of the sun. On her wrists, where golden bracelets had once jingled, flaunted rough, ulcerating scars from the shackles she had worn for long months after the fall of her clan. She sat on a lumpy mattress, clutching a fragment of an old whetstone, and her gaze, heavy, amber, filled with frozen fury, was fixed on the only exit from the basement. Upstairs, behind a heavy oak door, lived the man who was supposed to have chopped off her head, but who had instead become her jailer and her sole protector. Elias Thorne was nothing like the hero from the fairy tales that children whispered to each other in the Orcish tribes. In his early 30s, he looked a full 40. His shoulders, once squared beneath the weight of a captain's cloak, now sagged, and his face, scarred by blades and time, constantly bore an expression of hollow exhaustion. He was an executioner. He was the one whose blade hadn't wavered on the night of the coup when he executed her brothers, but which had suddenly dulled when it was Aelina's turn. He hadn't saved her out of compassion, which might have been understandable. He had saved her out of the cold, calculating desperation of a man who could no longer bear to see blood on his hands. And now he paid for it with alienation, alcoholism, and that strange, morbid coexistence that was worse than any prison. The creak of the stairs sounded suddenly. Aelina tensed. Her muscles, despite her exhaustion, responded with instant readiness. The door cracked open, letting in a sliver of dim, yellowish light from a kerosene lamp. Elias descended, stepping heavily on the rotting stairs. He held a tray in his hands. The smell of bread, rancid butter, and cured meat hit Aelina's nose, triggering a traitorous spasm in her empty stomach. "Eat," he said, setting the tray down on the edge of an old, woodworm-eaten chest. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken a word in days. Aelina didn't move. She looked up at him, and her gaze held such a concentration of hatred that Elias involuntarily looked away. She saw him shift from foot to foot. He didn't look like the master of the situation. He looked like a man terrified of his own prisoner. "Why are you still here?" Her voice, low and guttural, sounded like a threat in the basement. "Why didn't you finish me off that same night? You were so close. One swing, one motion. You would have become a hero. You would have received all my father's lands, all his wealth. Instead, you chose to rot here in this hole, hiding me like some plague-ridden dog." Elias sighed heavily. His shoulders dropped even lower for a second. "Do you think this is for your sake? Do you think I did this out of love for an Orcish princess? No, Aelina. I did it so that, for once in my life, I wouldn't obey an order. That night, when I walked into your room, I didn't see an enemy. I saw myself. The very same boy who was once forced to become a tool in the hands of the council. I just I just couldn't be the one pulling the trigger again. He sat down on an overturned crate. The distance between them was almost palpable, an abyss that could not be filled with words. I live in hell every day, but at least in this hell I don't have your blood on my hands. That's the only balance I can afford. Aelina slowly stood up. She was taller than him, even when he was sitting, and her shadow covered him like a shroud. She took a step forward, her fangs tightly clenched, sparks of true Orcish fury dancing in her amber eyes. "You call this balance?" she hissed. "You stole my life. You robbed me of the chance to die with a sword in my hands, as befits my lineage. You turned me into a thing, an object you keep in a basement to stroke your bruised ego. How dare you call that balance?" Elias raised his eyes to her. There was no fear in them. There was such a deep, hopeless sorrow that Aelina faltered for a second. "I didn't steal your life," he replied quietly. "I gave you time. Time to understand. The world you knew no longer exists. Your clan is gone. Your father is gone. If you had gone to the other side that night, you would have died in ignorance. But this way, you can decide what to do with what's left." "And what is left?" She poured all her pain into those words. "A basement? Rats? Your handouts? You are left." He finally looked her straight in the eye, unflinching. "And that's enough to start a new story, even if it begins here, in the dark." He turned and began to climb the stairs. Aelina saw how heavily he leaned on the railing. She noticed him wince. An old knee injury, received back during the siege of the citadel, was making itself known. She remembered how he fought back then, how fast he was, how ruthless he was. Now, he was just a shadow of that warrior. When the door slammed shut upstairs, she was left alone. Aelina approached the tray. The bread was dry, the meat tough, but she began to eat, not out of gratitude, but because she knew. To kill him, to get out of here, she needed strength. She had no intention of becoming his part of the family or his redemption project. She was a warrior, and her only goal was to wait for the moment when this executioner finally grew too weak. But deep in her soul, the very one she hid so carefully even from herself, an unpleasant realization was brewing. He wasn't the monster she had painted in her imagination. He was a creature who suffered just as much as she did, and this shared pain was the most dangerous thing that could happen between them. The next morning, when Elias came down again to collect the empty dishes, Aelina wasn't waiting for him with curses. She sat by the wall, sorting through the scraps of leather he had brought her so she could train her fingers. "Why did you bring this?" she asked, pointing at the pieces of rough leather. "You need to learn to sew," he replied without looking up. "Your rags will soon turn to dust. If we want you to be able to go out, you need normal clothes." She picked up a piece of leather. It was thick, high quality. It was the hide of a wild boar that he had tanned himself. "You're not just an executioner," she said, eyeing the stitching on his own clothes. "You're a craftsman." He froze. "I was whatever the clan required. A blacksmith, an executioner, a soldier. Now I am nothing." "Nothing happens just because," she began to pierce the leather with a needle, doing so with Orcish methodicalness. "You know how to work with your hands. That's a rare gift for a man who spent his life destroying others." Elias sat on the crate and began to clean his dagger. It was a strange coexistence. Two enemies whose lives were interlocked like gears in a broken mechanism. "If I teach you how to work with leather," he said without looking at her,
You'll be able to make yourself clothes that won't give you away as an aristocrat.
If you ever decide to leave, you'll need that.
You still think I'll leave? She asked.
I think you deserve a choice. And in this basement, you don't have one. They spent an hour working in silence. Aelina sewed, Elias honed his blade. At that moment, there was no hatred between them. There was only shared work, a shared space, and the realization that they were both two pieces of wreckage washed ashore by the same storm. Aelina looked closely at his hands for the first time. They were covered in burns. Small, old burns from the forge, deep scars from cuts. These were the hands of a man accustomed to working, not just giving orders.
You're not an executioner, she said quietly.
He looked up, and for a second his entire life was reflected in his eyes, a life in which he had never chosen his own fate. I am what they forced me to be.
Then why didn't you stop? She asked, pouring her soul into the question. Why did you choose this exact path? Why did you save me?
Elias lowered his head. Because that night, when I came for you, I saw something in your eyes that made me remember what the sun looks like. I decided that if I did what my heart told me just once, instead of following orders, maybe I could die as a man. Aelina froze. She realized that he wasn't just her jailer. He was a man who, slowly, day by day, was trying to put himself back together from the shards that remained after he had nearly destroyed everything he held dear. And she was the only one who witnessed this process. She continued to sew, but her hands moved more softly now. She felt a thin, almost transparent thread stretch between them. It wasn't friendship, not love. It was recognition. The recognition that they had both survived, and that now they were doomed to share this small, dark world. That night, for the first time since everything happened, she went to sleep knowing that if she woke up, he would be there. He wouldn't leave. And this fact, which used to frighten her, now brought a strange, almost soothing feeling. She was alive. And perhaps he was the only one who knew the price she had paid for it. She closed her eyes, listening to Elias walking around the shop upstairs, moving tools. It was no longer the sound of a jailer. It was the sound of a man guarding her peace. And that thought was the strangest one that had ever entered her Orcish head. She was a warrior, an aristocrat, an exile. And now, she was part of something that could not be destroyed by sword or word. She was part of a story they were writing together, blow by blow, stitch by stitch. And this was only the beginning. Time in the Iron Hulk ceased to be linear. It compressed, turning into an endless cycle of hammer blows on red-hot iron, the hiss of water in the quenching tub, and the monotonous screech of the whetstone on which Aelina spent hours honing the blade of her axe. The basement that had become her prison was gradually taking on the shape of a workshop. Elias began to come down to her more often, moving some of the work downstairs, where the smoke from the forge mixed with the staleness of the old walls. He no longer locked her in when he left. It was an unspoken agreement, saturated with mutual trust, that they were both afraid to voice aloud. For Elias, this period was like the healing of a deep, festering wound. Every time he looked at Aelina, at her strong, green hands managing the red-hot steel with incredible dexterity, he didn't see the object of his redemption. He saw a person, even if that person was an orc. In their world, this was considered heresy, madness, a betrayal of everything he had been taught in the order of executioners. But down here, beneath the weight of the city streets, the laws of clans and kings had no power.
"You take on too much," she said one day, as he staggered, putting down the heavy tongs. His leg, damaged in past battles, was acting up again. He limped with every step.
"Your joint is inflamed. You're pushing it as if you have 3 lives to spare." Elias sat down on an old wooden crate, breathing heavily. His face was slick with sweat, and his eye patch had slipped slightly. "It's just metal, Aelina. It doesn't know how to feel pain, and I'm learning not to feel it either." She walked over to him, holding a small jar of thick ointment that smelled of pine needles and something bitter. She had found these herbs in the cracks of the stone foundation. They grew there, stubbornly, defying the darkness and dampness. "You're lying," she said simply. "You feel every spark that lands on your skin. You feel every hammer strike that echoes in your bones. You just think that if you keep quiet, the pain will go away on its own. But it doesn't. Pain builds up like rust, and if you don't remove it, it will destroy everything." She dropped to her knees before him, uncaring that it was humiliating for someone of her people. She was an aristocrat, but right now she was someone who knew the value of healing. She began to untie his trouser leg, exposing the old, ugly scar running across his entire knee. Elias flinched, but didn't pull away. Her fingers, rough with traces of forge soot under the nails, touched his skin softly, almost weightlessly. She began to rub the ointment in circular motions, warming his leg with her own heat. It was a strange, almost surreal sight. An Orcish warrior princess healing the executioner who was meant to kill her. "How do you know these recipes?" he asked, watching her strong hands work on his body. His voice sounded hollow, as if he were afraid of shattering this fragile moment. "In my clan, the healer was the second person after the chieftain," she answered, without looking up. "But healing isn't just about herbs. It's an understanding of how living things work. You build armor to protect the flesh. I know how to fix the flesh when the armor fails. We do the same thing, Elias. We just work with different materials." He watched her. In her eyes, when she looked at his leg, there wasn't a drop of hatred. Only a cold, almost engineered focus, which gradually shifted into something else. A deep, bottomless attention. He felt the pain subsiding, the heat from her hands seeping into the very bone, driving out the years-old ache. It was like tempering, only instead of fire, it was her care. "Thank you," he whispered. She looked up. "Don't thank me. We're even. You gave me the chance to live. I'm giving you the chance to walk. And that's how it will always be, as long as we're here." That evening they worked late into the night. They were forging a batch of door handles for a local shopkeeper, a boring order, but one that provided them with food and new materials. Aelina was assisting. She had learned to predict which tool he would need before he even asked for it. She felt the rhythm of his work, his breathing, his fatigue. She knew when he would start to lose pace, and in that moment, she would pump the bellows, giving him a chance to catch his breath without breaking the flow of work. It was their silent unity. Two outcasts who suddenly discovered that together they formed a whole. Elias, a man with the past of an executioner, and Aelina, an orc with a future she wasn't supposed to have. "You know," she said when the fire in the forge began to die down, "I used to think the scariest thing was being alone. When I sat in that cage, I prayed for them to just kill me so the isolation would end. But now I realize that the scariest thing is being alone among a multitude of people who don't see you." Elias stopped, holding the hammer over the anvil. "They didn't see me either. They saw the captain.
They saw the executioner. They saw the sword that executed their will.
None of them saw the man who couldn't sleep at night because he heard the screams of those he killed. He looked at her, and in that look was an acknowledgement that meant more than any oath. You are the only one who truly sees me, Aelina. You see the executioner, but you also see what's left beneath that layer of rust. She stood up and walked over to him. In the gloom of the forge, amidst the shadows and dying coals, she suddenly saw his face, not as the face of a killer, but as the face of a man whose life had been sacrificed to someone else's greed. She placed her hand on his cheek, the one that bore a deep burn scar received on the day he saved her. "We are not what they made of us," she said. "We are what we do after they try to break us." He covered her hand with his. It was a gesture that spoke of more than any intimacy. It was an acknowledgement that they were allies, not by order, not by force, by choice. Suddenly outside on the narrow street there was a noise. The thunder of boots, the clanking of iron. A patrol. Elias instantly pulled away, his hand falling to the hilt of his sword. Aelina blew out the candle, plunging the workshop into the saving twilight of the forge. "They're back," he whispered, steel returning to his voice. Someone talked. Aelina grabbed her axe. Her heart pounded, not out of fear, but from that same long-forgotten warrior's fury, which was now directed at protecting their shared home. "Let me handle this," she said. "No," he shook his head. "You are my master craftsman. You are my life. Today, I will be your shield." They stood in the dark, listening as the guards battered the shop door. Their life in this basement, a life full of rust, herbs, and silence, was coming to an end. The battle they had both expected was beginning, but each of them was prepared for it in their own way. Elias looked at Aelina. In her eyes, he didn't see an Orcish slave, nor an exiled aristocrat. He saw the one for whom he was ready to burn this city to the ground. "If we leave here, we can never return to our old lives," he said. "I never wanted to return," she replied. "I want to move forward." The basement door began to shudder under the blows of battering rams. Elias took a deep breath, straightened up, and Aelina saw before her not a broken blacksmith, but the captain, ready to take responsibility for the fate of the world. "Then let's go," he said. They were ready. Two outcasts, two warriors, two shattered pieces, who had finally found each other to become something more than mere victims of circumstance. It was their choice. It was their duty. And it was their life. The basement door didn't just shudder. It splintered into pieces, and the cold, rain-soaked air from the street rushed into the breach, mixing with the stifling stench of the dungeon. 4 guards burst inside, their torches snatching the shapes of the forge from the darkness. The anvil, piles of coal, Aelina frozen in a combat stance with her axe, and Elias, whose figure seemed to absorb all the light around him. The first guard, whose face was hidden under a helmet with a narrow slit, didn't even have time to scream. Elias moved with that terrifying, calculated efficiency that had once brought him fame as the best blade in the clan's army. He didn't try defense. He simply eliminated the threat. His sword, long, straight, with a hilt wrapped in old, frayed leather, traced an arc, knocking the torch from the attacker's hand. In the next second, Elias was inside the guard's perimeter, striking him in the temple with his pommel. Aelina worked differently. She was the embodiment of fury, but it was a cold,
calculating fury. She didn't just strike. Ta anticipated. She felt how the enemy's muscles tensed, how their breathing changed, how they shifted their weight before a lunge. When the second guard tried to get behind her, she was already there, sidestepping his strike and delivering a crushing counterblow with the butt of her axe to his knee. The crunch of bone drowned in the clatter of falling tools. "Get back!" Elias barked, shielding her with his body as the third guard drew a heavy crossbow. The bolt whistled an inch from her ear, embedding itself in a wooden workbench. Aelina pushed off the wall and executed a jump impossible for a human, but natural for one who had spent years training her orcish body. Mid-flight, she tackled the shooter, slamming him into the stone masonry of the wall. He went limp, his armor dented by the force of the impact. Chaos reigned in the forge. The clash of steel, cries of pain, the smell of ozone and burnt leather. Elias worked like a machine. He didn't feel the pain in his old scar. He didn't feel the weight of his years. He was the captain again, whose word was law on the battlefield. But then a fifth man stepped out of the shadows of the corridor. He was unlike the rest. He wore a leather cloak that Elias would recognize anywhere. It was the cloak of an Inquisitor from the High Council of the clan. He held no sword in his hands. His fingers were extended, and sparks of black flame danced between them. "Executioner," the Inquisitor said, his voice the grating of a tombstone. "Did you really think we would just let you fade into the shadows? The clan does not forgive mistakes. The clan does not forgive betrayal. And most of all, the clan does not forgive those who steal its property." He pointed at Aelina. She froze. She knew this man. It was Salvatore, her uncle, the very man who had personally signed the order for the massacre of her family, the one who had personally watched her lose everything, standing on the palace balcony with a glass of wine in his hand. "Salvatore," she whispered, and there was so much pain in that name that Elias felt everything inside him tighten. "Aelina," Salvatore smiled, a smile sharper than any dagger. "Your father was a weak dreamer. You are merely a mistake that I will correct today. And you, Elias, you were a good dog. But even the most loyal dog catches rabies." The Inquisitor waved his hand, and black flame struck toward the forge. Elias reacted instantly, throwing himself in front of Aelina. He raised his sword, but the flame was magical. It bypassed the steel, burning his hands, melting the fabric of his cloak. Elias cried out, his knees buckling, but he didn't give an inch. "Aelina, run!" he roared. "He'll kill you!" "No!" Aelina lunged forward. She saw the flame devouring his clothes, how he, ignoring the pain, tried to break through to the mage. She wouldn't listen. She knew that the only way to defeat an Inquisitor was to strike not at him, but at the very foundation of his magic. She remembered Bruno's lessons, the vulnerable point in the structure. She couldn't see magic with her eyes, but she could taste it, bitter, metallic, disgusting. She darted to the side, flanking Salvatore in an arc, using overturned crates and broken tables for cover. Salvatore laughed. He didn't see her as a threat. He only saw an orcish slave trying to play war. "You are nothing," he said, preparing another volley of black fire. But Aelina was already close. She didn't strike him with her axe. She struck him in the chest, with the palm of her hand, putting into that shove all her orcish might, and that strange energy she had discovered within herself in the forests. The blow landed precisely where his amulet, the focus of his power, touched his skin. The amulet cracked. Valtor's magic exploded, turning against him. Waves of black flame struck him, consuming his cloak, his face, his arrogance. He screamed, not from pain, but from the realization that he had lost to this worthless slave. When the smoke cleared, the Inquisitor lay on the floor, reduced to a limp shadow. All his power had turned to ash.
Aelina sank heavily to the floor, her hands burning. Elias, struggling to his feet, hobbled over to her. He was badly burned, his shirt reduced to tatters. But his eyes, they shone with something she had never seen before. Recognition. The pure, absolute recognition that they were equals. "You defeated him," he whispered, dropping down beside her.
"We defeated him," she corrected. "It was our fight." He looked at her, and in that moment all the old barriers, the barrier between executioner and victim, master and slave, vanished completely. He carefully took her palm, burned by magic, and pressed it to his lips. It was a gesture of such tenderness that Aelina felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't ashamed of them. You're hurt," he said, his voice full of despair. "It will heal," she answered. "Everything heals, if there is a reason for it. You saved me, Elias. Again."
"No," he shook his head. "You saved me. From him, from my past, from remaining the man I was." They sat amidst the ruins of the workshop, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies. But for the first time in 5 years, there was no fear in their hearts. The city outside was still noisy, the clan still ruled, but here, in this basement, they were free.
"What do we do now?" Aelina asked.
Elias looked at the destroyed door, at the night sky, which no longer seemed so dark. Now we leave, forever. We leave this city behind, and if they come again, we will meet them as warriors, not as fugitives. He stood up, helping her to her feet. They were wounded, they were exhausted, but they were together. "Aelina," he said, looking into her eyes, "I know you are an aristocrat. I know your place is not here in the dirt. But if you are ready, I want to build a home where no one will find us, where we will just be us." Aelina smiled, genuinely, for the first time in this life.
"I don't want to be an aristocrat, Elias.
I want to be the one who tends to your wounds, and the one who stands by your side when the world decides to challenge us." They left the shop. The sun was rising over Salvatore, the first dawn of their new life. They walked down the empty street, not hiding, not looking back. Their path lay toward the southern slope, toward those very mountains where they had once been strangers, but which were now destined to become the only thing that made sense in this world. They were a family, the executioner and the exile, and no magic, no clan, no destiny could stand in their way anymore. It was a story of how, from the ashes of hatred and the rust of betrayal, something is born that cannot be destroyed, the right to one's own happiness. They walked further and further from the city, and every step was an affirmation for them. They hadn't just survived. They had won. The valley of the southern slope greeted them with a silence that at first seemed deafening. After months spent in the basement of the Iron Hulk, constantly waiting for a blow, after the bloody madness of Salvatore and the persecution of the Inquisitors, this silence was almost painful. Here, at an altitude where the air was so pure it burned the lungs, time seemed to slow its run. They arrived at sunset, when the last rays of the sun painted the granite peaks the color of dried blood, a sight that yesterday would have triggered a fit of rage in Aelina, but today brought only a strange, melancholic calm. Their new home, if one could call a leaning shack half buried in the ground and overgrown with wild ivy a home, stood on the edge of a deep ravine. Bruno, or the man she still habitually called that, although he increasingly asked her to use the name he bore before becoming the executioner, was the first to jump down from the wagon. He moved slowly, leaning carefully on the leg that was still aching after the fight.
He wasn't the invincible warrior from their dreams. He was a man whose body bore the seal of all the battles he had survived. Not much, he noted, surveying their future dwelling. There was no disappointment in his voice, only the businesslike assessment of a master. The roof needs replacing, the walls need caulking, and the forge, if there is one here, it will have to be rebuilt from scratch. Aelina walked up to him. She felt the earth breathing beneath her feet. This wasn't the dead soil of Salvatore, soaked in filth. This was living earth, full of hidden power. She knew that here they wouldn't just survive. They would take root. "We have everything we need," she replied, catching his gaze. "We have tools, we have seeds, and we have time. For the first time in our lives, Elias, we have time." They started by clearing it out. Week after week, they hauled out dust, broken furniture, and years of accumulated trash from the shack. Elias worked like a man possessed. He erected walls, laying stones with such precision as if he were building the foundation for a whole empire. He no longer smoked or drank. His only stimulant was physical labor. Aelina became his shadow and his pillar of support. She found the best wood in the forest for the rafters, boiled pitch in cauldrons to protect the timber, and, most importantly, she began to cultivate a garden. It was the strangest occupation of her life. She, an Orcish aristocrat who knew the intricacies of fencing and clan diplomacy, now spent hours crawling on her knees, seeking out the best plots of land for planting herbs. She began to notice patterns. Which herbs liked the shade, which liked the sun, which required moisture, and which needed dry, rocky soil. She learned to listen to the earth the way she used to listen to the whispers of her enemies. And the earth answered her. Soon, seedlings sprouted around the shack, small, weak, but full of life. Their existence was harsh, almost Spartan. But in this harshness there was something they had both lacked their entire lives: clarity. There were no secrets here, no orders to execute, no blood to wash away. There was only work that yielded results. Every evening when the sun dipped behind the mountains, they sat on the porch and shared a simple meal. In those moments, they became closer than ever. "Do you ever miss your family?" he asked one evening, as they watched the sky turn soft purple. Aelina was silent for a long time. She looked at her hands, the hands of a warrior, now covered in dirt and scratches. "I don't miss the family as an institution," she answered. "I miss the feeling of knowing you belong to something bigger. In the Ashtor clan, we were part of a mechanism that had existed for millennia. But now I feel like we are seeds carried by the wind into a rock crevice. We will either take root and break this rock, or we will die without leaving a trace." Elias took her hand. His fingers were hard, calloused, but their touch was softer than silk. We will take root, Aelina. I've forged thousands of swords, but I've never created anything as strong as what we are building right now. They started calling this place theirs. Not the shack, not the workshop, but theirs. And this change in language brought a change in their hearts. Aelina started calling him Elias, not captain, not executioner, not you. Just Elias. And he began to look at her not as the rescued one, but as a woman who had become his equal. But the world hadn't forgotten them. The clan, having lost the trail of their ghosts, began to comb the valleys. They didn't look for them in the cities. They knew traitors would seek solitude. Aelina sensed the danger at night. She was awake, lying on the wide bed they had crafted from cedar. Elias slept beside her, his breathing steady, calm. She got up and quietly stepped outside. The forest was full of rustling, unnatural, alien. She felt the presence of those who did not belong to this valley. She returned to the house and gently touched Elias's shoulder. He woke instantly, without fuss. "Who?" he whispered, already reaching for the sword that now hung over the bed. "A pack of hounds," she said. "They're close. Too close." Elias sat up, his eyes flashing with a cold, resolute light in the darkness. "They don't know this is our home. They think it's just an abandoned farm." "We will make them regret ever deciding to cross the border of our land," Aelina said. Her voice was devoid of fear. It held only icy certainty. They didn't run. They began to prepare. This wasn't a battle in a field. This was a battle for every inch of their sanctuary. Elias set traps, simple but deadly contraptions that could stop even an experienced hunter. Aelina occupied herself with what she knew best. She used her skills as a healer and herbalist. She prepared concoctions that caused hallucinations when inhaled and paralysis upon skin contact. By the time the first rays of the sun touched the mountain peaks, they were ready. They stood on the porch, two warriors who had decided their lives were worth fighting for. When the hounds appeared at the edge of the forest, they looked confident. There were 8 of them. They weren't hiding. They knew that out here in the wilderness, no one could stand against them. "Come out!" the leader shouted, waving his sword. "We know you're here. No mountains can hide you from the council's wrath." Elias took a step forward. He no longer looked like a washed-up executioner. He was the embodiment of fury clad in steel. "You've gone too far," he said. "This home is no place for your blood." They rushed to attack, but this wasn't the kind of fight they were used to. They ran into invisible barriers, into traps that left no room for error. Elias and Aelina worked with clockwork precision. They didn't just kill. They forced the enemies to back themselves into a corner. Aelina moved with incredible speed. She didn't use an axe. She used her hands, coated in her herbal mixtures. A single touch, and a hound froze, paralyzed, his mind trapped by his own fears. Elias was inexorable. He wasn't looking for blood. He was looking for weakness. He incapacitated everyone who tried to approach their threshold with an efficiency bordering on cruelty. A few minutes later, it was all over. 8 of the clan's best hunters lay on the ground, helpless, unable even to raise a cry. Elias walked up to the leader, who looked at him with wild terror. "Tell your masters," Elias said, leaning close to his face, "that this path is closed. If they come again, they won't leave. We are no longer who you made us to be. We are those who chose our own path." The hunters crawled away, leaving trails of blood behind them. They couldn't even stand. Their will had been crushed, their tools destroyed. Aelina sank onto the porch, feeling her arms begin to tremble from the tension. She didn't see him. She didn't see Elias approach and carefully wrap his arms around her shoulders. "We won," he said, his voice full of triumph. "We didn't win," she replied, watching the last hunters disappear into the thicket. "We affirmed our right to live." They sat on the porch, two warriors who had turned the horror of their past into the foundation of their future. The sun began to rise over the mountains, illuminating their home, their small, safe world, for which they were ready to fight to the last drop of blood. It was a story that would never be told in chronicles, but to the two of them, it meant everything. They weren't just a family. They were the ones who had rewritten the rules of the game itself. And as long as they stood here, hand in hand, no darkness could touch them. This was the beginning of what they called happiness. And this happiness was forged in fire, tempered in pain, and forever cemented by their loyalty to each other. They were free. And that was enough.
The valley of the southern slope ceased to be merely a geographical point on the map. It turned into a symbol, a quiet but relentless challenge to the clan empire. Rumors of the two ghosts who didn't pillage but built, who didn't conquer lands but taught how to cultivate them, spread among slaves and runaway guards with the speed of a forest fire. At first, one person would come, exhausted and broken, hoping only for a cup of water. Then a whole family would arrive, hiding from tax collectors. And each of them found here not just a night's lodging, but something far more dangerous to the empire. They found the belief that life could be different. Aelina and Elias stood on the porch of their expanded estate, watching as another group of refugees descended into the valley with the first rays of the sun. These were people with mutilated fates, many of whom had gone through the same shackles as Aelina. Bruno, to her he always remained Bruno, the man who swapped his sword for a plow, felt their approach on his skin. He didn't need eyes to understand. Their small world, this island of peace they had forged from pain and rust, no longer belonged solely to the two of them. "There are too many of them, Elias," Aelina whispered, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the axe, which now hung by the door as a symbol of protection, not aggression. "We can't feed everyone. Winter is coming, and our storehouses aren't bottomless." He placed his palm over her hand, feeling the cold metal she was so used to gripping. "We won't feed them with pity, Aelina. We will teach them to feed themselves. Look at them. These aren't just mouths. They are working hands. Here in this valley, we have everything: iron ore, timber, fertile soil. The clan wants people to be slaves because slaves fear hunger. But we will make them free, because a free man knows the value of what he has grown with his own hands." It was a strategy they had developed together. Elias, the former executioner whose mind was honed by years of service in the dirtiest corridors of power, now used his intellect to create a system that was absolutely impenetrable to the clan's taxmen and spies. Aelina, the aristocrat whose name had been consigned to oblivion, used her authority and Orcish discipline to unite these people into a community where everyone knew their place and was ready to defend their neighbor. The days turned into an endless cycle of creation. They expanded the irrigation system, damming the mountain stream so that it fed not only their plot, but all the fields in the valley. Bruno opened a new, larger forge where, alongside former captives, he taught them to forge tools that were 10 times more reliable than those produced by imperial factories. Aelina became the unofficial strategist.
She taught the newcomers not martial arts, but what Elias called structural survival. How to spot an ambush by the behavior of birds, how to hide supplies in the forest so that not even a trained hound could find them, how to dress wounds using only what grew beneath their feet. They became akin to gods to these people, but they themselves didn't seek worship. They sought the peace they had been denied for so long. And yet, at night, when the valley slept, they often sat by the fire, discussing what lay ahead. "Do you feel it?" Elias asked one day, looking at the stars, which from this altitude seemed like huge, pulsating fires. "They will come. The clan army won't tolerate the existence of an independent enclave. To them, this is like gangrene. If they don't cut us off, the contagion of freedom will spread to other provinces." Aelina walked over and sat beside him, pressing her shoulder against his rough but deeply familiar shoulder. "Let them come. We are not who we were 5 years ago. We are not just two outcasts. We are the core."
If they try to destroy us, they will face an entire valley of people who have nothing more to lose.
"I'm not afraid for myself," he admitted, and his voice carried that very vulnerability he had hidden for so long. "I'm afraid that, defending this place, I'll turn back into the man I was, an executioner. I don't want to kill anymore, Aelina. I want to build." She turned to him, her eyes glowing with soft gold. "To kill means playing by their rules. We won't play by their rules. We will meet them in a way they don't expect. We won't fight them out in the open. We will make their presence in our valley impossible. We will act not as an army, but as the forest itself, as the earth itself. They will be fighting shadows that know every bush, every rock, every tree." And so they did. Over the following months, the valley turned into a trap. Every entrance to the valley was rigged with traps that worked on physics and psychology. They didn't build barricades. They built labyrinths. They didn't forge swords. They forged obstacles. When clan scouts tried to penetrate the valley, they simply vanished. Not because they were killed, but because they lost their bearings, their supplies spoiled, their horses grew spooked by the sounds the forest itself made. It was a war of attrition that the clan was losing before it even realized it had begun. But the clan wouldn't be the clan if it didn't resort to extreme measures. The warlord, the very one who commanded the massacre of the Ashtor clan, personally led the punitive expedition. He brought with him not just soldiers. He brought regiments of destructive mages whose goal was not to capture the valley, but to wipe it off the face of the earth along with every living creature. He didn't want submission. He wanted total annihilation, so that no one would ever dare even think about freedom. On the day their banners appeared on the horizon, Aelina and Elias stood on a hillside.
The sight of the army pouring over the plains like a black wave was terrifying. Tens of thousands of warriors, magical siege engines, roaring beasts. It all seemed like the end of the world.
"Well, this is it,"
Elias whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword.
"Now, if we hold out, we won't just be fugitives. We will become a legend that everyone will have to reckon with. Or we'll just become another stain on the map,"
Aelina added, her voice unwavering. She looked at Elias, the man who had once come to kill her, and now stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to accept any outcome.
"You know what the strangest thing is? I have no regrets. Even if this is our last day, I am glad I met you."
He smiled, and in that smile,
There wasn't a drop of fear. Me too. But I'm not planning on dying today. I still have plans for this garden. They walked down the hill to the people. Their people. Hundreds of men, women, orcs, who were once slaves but now held tools reforged into something greater. They weren't a professional army, but their eyes burned with something the clan's mercenaries lacked. They had a purpose. They had their own home. "Listen to me!" Aelina's voice, amplified by blood magic, echoed over the valley like thunder. "They came for our home. They came for our freedom. They think we are just dust beneath their boots. But today, we will show them that even dust can turn into a storm if you squeeze it hard enough." Elias stepped forward. He didn't make a grandiose speech. He simply raised his old sword, a blade that was now a tool of protection, not an executioner's punishment. "For every day of our peace, for every sprout in our garden, for the fact that we finally stopped being afraid. Forward!" And the valley answered them with a roar. It wasn't a roar of fury. It was the roar of people who had finally earned the right to call themselves who they truly were. The battle began with the ground beneath the clan army simply splitting open. The traps Elias had spent months preparing worked perfectly. There was no frontal assault. There was an absorption. The army simply drowned in the valley itself. Mages tried to cast spells, but Aelina, using her knowledge and the power of the earth, simply jammed their abilities, forcing the magical currents deep into the soil. It was total domination, not by force, but by knowledge. They didn't kill unnecessarily. They simply made further advance impossible. By evening, the clan army was demoralized. Their commanders were disoriented, their warriors exhausted from fighting not soldiers, but the very environment which seemed to protect these people. When the warlord himself, riding a massive beast, tried to break through to the shack, he found only two people there, Elias and Aelina. They stood on the porch as if waiting for him for dinner. "You," the warlord spat blood, his eyes darting around in search of guards who had vanished in their labyrinths. "You, an executioner who sold his honor for an Orcish whore." Elias didn't budge. He simply raised his sword. "I didn't sell my honor. I found it where you lost yours. In compassion." Aelina took a step forward. Her eyes burned with gold. "Your clan is finished, warlord. You didn't lose today. You lost 5 years ago when you decided you could destroy everything that didn't fit into your narrow framework." The fight was swift. The warlord, who believed himself invincible, was unready for the fact that two people who were once nothing had now become the greatest threat to his power. Elias and Aelina acted as one entity. He distracted, she delivered the decisive blow. A minute later, it was all over. The warlord lay in the dust, realizing that his army no longer obeyed him, that his power was a mirage that crumbled at the first collision with reality. They didn't kill him. They simply left him in the dust. Let him live with the fact that his army was defeated not by swords, but by the will of people he considered non-entities. When the sun set, the valley plunged back into silence. But it was a different silence. The silence of victors. The people of the hearth began to emerge from their shelters. They looked at Elias and Aelina not with worship, but with gratitude. "We won," Elias said, lowering his sword. "We started living," Aelina corrected him. They were a family, and this family was greater than any empire. It was proof that even after the most terrible betrayal, after the harshest exile, one can find a home. And this home would stand forever, because it was built on the strongest steel in the world, on loyalty to one another. The years following the great retreat of the clan army turned the valley of the southern slope into a place designated on all maps created by merchants and travelers as the Lands of Free Breath. The legend of the executioner and the Orcish aristocrat grew so encrusted with hearsay that a couple of years later, not only fugitives flocked to the valley, but also those simply seeking the truth. The world outside was in turmoil, the clan empire having lost its invincible army in the valley and facing uprisings in other provinces, began to burst at the seams. Their tyranny, once held together by the fear of magic and steel, now proved helpless against people who had stopped being afraid. Aelina stood on top of the hill, now called Watcher's Hill. Her clothes were no longer the rags of a slave. She wore simple but sturdy leather armor, crafted by Bruno's hands, light, elegant, and non-restricting. At her belt hung an axe, which she now used more often for chopping wood than for combat. Next to her, leaning on a staff, stood Elias. He was noticeably gray. Deep wrinkles lined the corners of his eyes, but they no longer held that terrifying emptiness that had haunted him in the early years after Salvatore. Down below, the valley teemed with life. Smoke from numerous chimneys wove into a single peaceful cloud, carried by the wind toward the empty mountains. Where there had once been only a leaning shack, a settlement now spread, built upon laws they and Bruno had derived from their own suffering. There were no slaves here. There were no clan chieftains whose word was law. There was a council consisting of elders, humans and orcs, who made decisions based on what everyone needed, not just those sitting at the top. They sent messengers, Elias said, looking at the road winding along the slope. From the central province. They say the emperor is dead, and the council has splintered into pieces. They want to know who leads these lands now. Aelina chuckled, lightly, without a hint of past sarcasm. Tell them no one rules anyone here. Tell them we are just a community of people who are tired of their wars. If they come in peace, let them sit at our table. If they come with a sword, well, you remember where your blade is. Elias laughed, that same deep, warm laugh she had learned to know as her own soul. I don't think they'll come. After our valley became an example for the whole region, the number of people wanting to stick their hands into this beehive has dropped. They walked down to the hearth. It was a path they had walked together, from the market square of Salvatore to this place, where they knew every stone. Along the road grew trees planted by the hands of those who had once come here with broken souls, but now looked at the world with hope. Children ran out to meet them, not only their adopted daughter Marin, but dozens of others whose parents had found refuge here. To these children, Aelina wasn't an orc, and Elias wasn't an executioner. They were simply Mom and Dad, or, more precisely, the ones who gave them the right to the childhood others had tried to steal from them. In the evening, a council began in the main hall of the Hearth, a large building constructed of stone and pine where a modest workshop had once stood. It wasn't like clan gatherings, where everyone trembled before the chieftain. Here, everyone spoke. And here, in the center, stood Aelina and Elias. We will not call ourselves a country, Aelina was saying, her voice firm and clear. We will not call ourselves a state. We are simply the Hearth, a place where the right to life is worth more than the right to power. Our strength lies not in weapons, but in the fact that we no longer need your rules. The meeting ended late. When the last guests had gone home, Aelina and Elias were left alone by the large fireplace that was the heart of the whole building. Elias threw on a log and sparks soared upward, dissolving into the darkness of the high ceiling. He walked over to Aelina and, without asking permission, hugged her. It was a movement that had become so natural that a day felt incomplete without it. She pressed against him, feeling his warmth, his calm, his unshakable devotion. "Do you know we changed the world?" he asked quietly. "Not just this valley. We showed them that you can live differently, that an executioner can become a creator, and an exile a pillar of support." "We didn't change anything, Elias," she countered, staring into the fire. "We just allowed people to change themselves. We gave them the tools, and they did the rest themselves. And that is the greatest victory one can achieve. Not a victory over an enemy, but a victory over the darkness that lives inside each of us." He looked at his hands. They were covered in calluses, soot ingrained in the folds of his skin. But these hands were clean of someone else's blood. "Do you ever think about who we would be if not for that night in Salvatore?" Aelina pondered. She saw the picture clearly. An executioner who keeps following orders until he is killed at another execution, and an exile who ends her life in some damp ditch, forgotten by everyone. "We would have been tools in someone else's hands," she replied. "But fate decreed otherwise. It brought us together so we could forge each other. And if I had to go through all of it again, through the basements, the torture, the fear, I wouldn't change a single day, because every day led me to you." Elias pulled her close, their foreheads touching, a gesture they had borrowed from the ancients, a gesture signifying absolute trust. "We started with betrayal and blood," he whispered, "and ended up creating heaven on earth. It was a hell of a job, Aelina, but it was worth it." "It was worth it," she repeated. That night it was quiet in the hearth. The wind howled in the mountains, but the house was warm. In the corner of the workshop, which had now simply become a room for creation, lay their tools, an old sword that had become a symbol of peace, and an axe that had become an instrument of creation. They no longer hid them. They no longer needed weapons. They had become something more than just humans or orcs. They had become the ones who proved, if two people find each other amidst the wreckage of their lives, they can build something that will outlast any empire. And when the sun rose over the valley again in the morning, illuminating their garden, their home, and their people, they both knew life goes on, not as an endless struggle, but as an endless possibility. They were free. They were home. And in their hearts, where there was once only darkness, the purest fire now burned, the fire of life, which no one could extinguish. Marin ran into the room, laughing, and brought an armful of wildflowers. She walked over to them and wove them into Aelina's hair. "Now you look like a queen and a king," she said with that spontaneity that only children possess. Elias laughed, sweeping her up in his arms. "We aren't kings, Marin. We're just the ones who learn to bake bread and guard our garden." "And that is enough," Aelina added, embracing them both. This was the last chapter of their story in this world. But somewhere out there, beyond the mountains, the legend of the hearth continued to live. It lived in the tales of merchants, in the songs of wanderers, in the hopes of those seeking their path. It was a story about how, one day on the market square of Salvatore, two people met. The one who came for death, and the one who refused to die. And how they rewrote history with their blood, their labor, and their love. And this finale was not the end. It was only the beginning of how the world learned that even from the heaviest shards of the past, you can forge a new, infinite life, if you have someone holding the anvil while you strike it. The valley bloomed. Marin laughed. And Elias and Aelina, standing on the threshold of their home, looked into the future, not with apprehension, but with an absolute, profound tranquility. They knew. They had made it. They had conquered time. They had found each other. And that was more than enough. It was everything one could ask for. They were a family. And in that lay the whole truth of their world, which proved to be stronger than any empire.